Why are cows used to plow fields instead of rhinos or elephants? Why are rice and wheat the main staples on our tables today? Why did Europe conquer the New World rather than ancient civilizations like China or Mesopotamia, where agriculture first emerged? Is history's course predetermined? If human societal development is like a survival game with ever-shrinking safe zones, was it all about landing in the right spot to make it to the final round? When discussing history, you can't just focus on history alone. From plants and animals to humans, this book takes you back to the dawn of human civilization, revealing a unique story of our shared past. What you'll gain from this video: understand the birth of agricultural civilizations and their impact. Analyze the reasons behind the uneven development of human societies. Discover why the New World was conquered, and debunk Eurocentrism. Hello guys. Have you ever wondered why the staples on our dinner tables today are wheat and rice, rather than almonds, apples, or pistachios and raisins? Or why our main sources of meat are pigs, cows, and sheep, instead of hippos, elephants, or giraffes? Why did the Mongol cavalry ride horses across the plains rather than reindeer or deer? And why are fields plowed by oxen today instead of rhinos or elephants? All of these questions can be answered in the book I'll be sharing with you today. Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies. As for why the author connected guns, germs, and steel with the fate of human societies, the book provides some fascinating answers. The author of this book is Jared Diamond, a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a background in evolutionary biology and biogeography. Before writing Guns, Germs, and Steel, Diamond published The Third Chimpanzee, a book that explores how humans diverged from animals and, over the course of 7 million years, became humans, while other animals remained animals. This book, however, doesn't go that far back. It starts around 13,000 or 11,000 BCE and continues up to the 16th century. To be honest, this isn't a practical book. It won't give you any skills, methods, or techniques to solve everyday problems. What makes it remarkable is that it helps you see the bigger picture, gives you a deeper understanding, and elevates your perspective. Guns, Germs, and Steel was published in 1996 and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1997. If you've read *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, you'll notice that many of the fundamental theories and ideas in that book stem from Guns, Germs, and Steel. So, what is this book about? It tackles an ultimate question, the ultimate question of human society. To introduce this question, Diamond shares a short story. In 1972, while studying bird evolution on the island of New Guinea, Diamond took a break from his work and went for a walk along the beach. There, he met a local politician named Yali. According to Diamond's description, Yali was a gentleman with deep thoughts. After some casual conversation, Yali posed a question to him. Yali asked, "Why is it that you white people produce so many goods and bring them to our land, while we have so few of our own?" Diamond referred to this as Yali's question. Diamond said this wasn't an easy question to answer. In fact, it took him from 1972 to 1996, 24 years, to write this book in order to answer Yali's question. And what was the essence of Yali's question? It's much deeper than it seems at first glance. At its core, it asks why the development of human societies is unequal, why some groups progress faster, better, and more advanced than others. We also know that in 1972, New Guinea was under Australian colonial rule. The independence movement started in 1973, and they finally gained independence in 1975. So we can even speculate that Yali's question politely avoided his true intention, which was, why are we being colonized by you? Why is it the white world colonizing us? Yali's reference to goods didn't just mean TVs, refrigerators, soap, beer, and soft drinks. It also encompassed deeper, more fundamental things like ideology and politics. At its core, Yali's question asked why human societies developed unevenly. This is akin to the ultimate questions we've always pondered. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Who are we? In a similar way, why has human society developed the way it has? Why are some people more advanced than others? Why were the Americas conquered by Europeans? This is the central theme Diamond tackles in the book. We know that the colonization of New Guinea began in the 18th century, and the roots of that wave of colonization can be traced back to 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. After that, Europe began its conquest of the Americas, sparking a global wave of colonization. Diamond shares another story to help us understand what colonialism and resistance looked like. It's full of details, and Diamond calls it the Battle of Cajamarca. Deep in the Peruvian highlands of the Americas, there was a city called Cajamarca, one of the largest cities of the Inca Empire. The protagonists of this story are a group of 168 Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, who ventured into the highlands and arrived in Cajamarca. One of the expedition members wrote in his diary about the complex emotions they felt, saying, "We had to hide our fear very carefully because if we showed even a hint of fear, our guides might kill us and offer us as a sacrifice to their ruler." Why? Why were these explorers or tourists so afraid? Because their mission wasn't a friendly visit or simple exploration. It was far more complex. Of course, when they arrived in Cajamarca, the city's welcoming hosts arranged accommodations for them. But that night, the Spanish explorers made a plan. The next morning, they were set to meet the Inca Emperor, Atahualpa. The diary describes in great detail the grand entrance of Atahualpa. When Atahualpa appeared, 2,000 men were sweeping the ground in front of him. Then came a large group of nobles, dressed in brightly colored robes. Finally, Atahualpa emerged, seated in a massive litter carried by 80 men. In historical films and literature, a litter carried by 8 men is already considered luxurious, but Atahualpa's litter, carried by 80 men, was adorned with gold, silver, and jewels and decorated with beautiful feathers. After a brief conversation, the Spanish explorers launched a surprise attack just as they had planned the night before. Gunfire erupted, followed by the sounds of battle. So what was the outcome? Let's take a look at the situation at the time. What were these 168 Spanish explorers up against? They faced not only all the citizens of one of the largest cities of the Inca Empire, but also Atahualpa's personal guard of 80,000 soldiers. What was the result? As you can probably guess, it ended with a Spanish victory. And not just a victory, but an absolute one. They not only scattered the 80,000-strong guard and killed 7,000 of them, but they also captured the Inca Emperor, Atahualpa. Afterward, Pizarro made one of the highest ransom demands in human history. They asked the Inca Empire to fill a 32-square-meter room to a height of 2.5 meters with gold in exchange for their emperor, Atahualpa. While they did receive the ransom, they still executed Atahualpa. Now, the author didn't share this story just to entertain us. He shared it to help us analyze how colonialism began. Similar stories played out across the Americas at the time, and in most cases, they ended with the European colonizers emerging victorious. But why did the European colonizers win? Why were 168 men able to defeat 80,000? The author begins by analyzing the weapons and equipment of both sides. What did the 168 Spanish explorers have? They had about 100 cavalrymen riding large horses, each of them wearing steel armor. Their infantry had about a dozen firearms and one small cannon. Every explorer was armed with sharp steel knives and spears. Now let's look at their opponents. The Inca, despite their 80,000-strong guard, had no horses. That's the first key difference. Why no horses? As the author later explains in detail, the Americas never domesticated an animal suitable for riding in battle. While they did domesticate llamas, we can all imagine that if a group of Inca warriors rode into battle on llamas, it would be more of a comedic scene than a formidable one. The llamas simply weren't capable of handling the intensity of warfare. Not only did the Incas lack horses, but they also didn't have armor. They wore soft leather padding, and they didn't carry sharp steel weapons either. Instead, they wielded stones, bronze clubs, wooden sticks, and slingshots. With such a stark contrast in equipment, the Inca warriors couldn't inflict significant damage on the 168 Spanish explorers While every weapon the Spanish carried was deadly, the result was inevitable. Next, we have to ask another question. Why were all the advantages on the side of the Spanish? Why didn't the Inca Empire possess these advantages? Aside from having the numbers, the Incas lacked all the key elements of war: horses, steel, firearms, cannons, knives. All of these were Spanish advantages. Why? The answer lies in Europe's accumulated industrial foundation, or more precisely, their advanced craftsmanship. Europe's more developed metallurgy enabled them to possess such technologies, while the Inca Empire did not. But why did Europe have these advancements while the Inca did not? The author describes this in the book. There was once a theory known as Eurocentrism. Eurocentrists believed that Europeans possessed superior genes or racial qualities, which enabled them to develop faster. In other words, they believed Europeans were more intelligent and hardworking, which is why they advanced further. But is this true? The author refutes this theory with 3 points. First, if we look solely at natural selection and genetics, Europeans aren't necessarily smarter than the peoples of the Americas. Europe had long-established welfare systems, so people lived under secure social conditions for many years. In such a secure environment, everyone, regardless of intelligence, could live comfortably and pass on their genes. But it was different in the Americas. The author uses New Guinea in 1972 as an example. At the time, New Guinea suffered from food shortages, social unrest, poor security, and a lack of health care. In such conditions, only the most intelligent individuals could thrive, gather food more efficiently, and pass on their genes. So, from a survival of the fittest perspective, the people living in harsher environments like the Americas would have accumulated better genes over generations than Europeans. This discredits the idea that Europeans were naturally smarter. Second, in 1972, European families spent about 6 hours a day watching TV, and today we can assume people spend a similar amount of time on the internet. Meanwhile, children in the Americas or New Guinea would have used that time for more active pursuits, exploring the world around them, playing games, or working. These activities are far more beneficial for brain development. So, in terms of developmental conditions, the people of the Americas or New Guinea should be more intelligent than Europeans. The author adds that after working with his colleagues in New Guinea for many years, he knew they were very intelligent. They simply didn't have the same knowledge base as Europeans. While we know how to operate a car or tune a TV to the right channel, they didn't, but that doesn't mean they weren't smart. Walking through the jungle with them, they could easily pick a leaf, name it, tell you if it was edible and how it should be eaten, or explain what animals fed on it. They were just as intelligent, but their expertise was in different areas. We can't conclude they were less intelligent simply because they didn't possess the same knowledge as us. Since it's not because Europeans were inherently smarter that Europe developed faster, what was the real reason for Europe's advancement? The author delves into this question in his analysis. If the reason for Europe's faster and stronger development wasn't superior intelligence, then what caused the uneven development of human societies? If we think of the development of human societies as a race, then there must be a starting line, which the author places around 13,000 to 11,000 BCE. Why set the starting line here? Because before this period, around the end of the last ice age, humans across the globe were living in similar conditions in terms of lifestyle, productivity, and development. Whether in the Americas, Eurasia, Africa, or even on islands in the Indian Ocean, people were all in similar states, a hunter-gatherer existence. It wasn't until around 13,000 to 11,000 BCE that some people first saw the dawn of agricultural civilization. And where did this dawn break? In Eurasia. The world's earliest agricultural civilizations emerged in 2 core areas, one in Southwest Asia, known as the Fertile Crescent, and the other in ancient China, in East Asia. You're likely familiar with ancient China, but where exactly is the Fertile Crescent? It refers to the region around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, often referred to as Mesopotamia. which today includes parts of Iran, Jordan, Israel, and Iraq. This crescent-shaped fertile area, covering about 400,000 square kilometers, played a key role. But why did agriculture first emerge in these two places? The author emphasizes that the birth of agriculture wasn't a deliberate choice. Why? It's not like one day a tribal leader had a brilliant idea to gather everyone and declare, "We're done with hunting. From now on, we'll plant crops." Since no one had any prior knowledge or examples to reference, the start of agricultural civilization must have been an unconscious process, a way of life that only emerged after long periods of trial and error. The author explains that there are three prerequisites for the development of agriculture. 1. Climate conditions. 2. Environmental conditions. 3. Resource availability. To understand how agriculture emerged from the domestication of plants, let's break down these three conditions. First, the climate. The Fertile Crescent has a typical Mediterranean climate, warm, moist, rainy, and with distinct seasons, providing an ideal environment for crop growth. Second, environmental factors. This refers to the geography of the region. The Fertile Crescent spans elevations ranging from a few hundred meters to several thousand meters, creating a diverse range of plant species, which ties into the third factor. The third factor is the availability of domesticable plant species. Out of the 200,000 plant species in nature, only about 1,000 are edible, and of those, only about 100 are commonly eaten by humans. Of those 100, fewer than 10 are considered staple foods. These include rice, wheat, sorghum, millet, corn, and potatoes. How did humans select these few species from the vast plant world, domesticate them, and begin cultivating them? It was a long, challenging process full of experimentation and uncertainty. People had to keep trying, bringing plants back to cultivate, observing which ones met their needs, and keeping the successful ones while discarding the failures. After more than 10,000 years of effort, humans settled on these staple crops. Interestingly, whether by coincidence or natural law, most of these crops belong to the same family in plant taxonomy, the large seed grasses. The crops we're familiar with, rice, wheat, sorghum, corn, and millet, are all large seed grasses. The term large seed refers to the fact that the seeds of these plants are at least 10 times heavier than the average seed weight in their family. Simply put, their seeds are large, and since we eat the seeds, it made harvesting and collecting them easier. Earlier, I mentioned that the first independent agricultural civilizations emerged in the Fertile Crescent and ancient China. Ancient China domesticated rice and millet, while the Fertile Crescent domesticated wheat. It wasn't until a few thousand years later that early Americans succeeded in domesticating corn and Africans domesticated sorghum. Why was there such a time lag? Were Africans slower or less capable? As I said earlier, it's not due to genetic differences. So what caused this delay? As we've discussed, the key factors are climate, environment, and the availability of domesticable species. The author lists all the large seed grasses in the world, and there are only about 50 species in total. Of these, more than 30 are found in the Fertile Crescent, while 6 are found near the Yellow and Yangtze River basins in ancient China. Given the combination of climate, environment, and resources, the Fertile Crescent and ancient China were the first to domesticate early crops and begin growing grain. But why didn't agriculture emerge earlier in places like the Americas, which also had suitable climates, soil, and geographic conditions? This has much to do with the characteristics of the plants themselves. If you compare wild wheat and rice with the cultivated varieties we know today, the connection between the wild and domesticated species is quite apparent. It's easy to see how humans could have domesticated their wild ancestors. The process of domestication was essentially one of continuous selection and optimization. The situation in the Americas was quite different. On the one hand, there were fewer species of large seed grasses available for domestication. On the other hand, the one species they eventually succeeded in domesticating, corn, had a wild ancestor that was difficult to identify. Before the advent of advanced genetics, scientists had heated debates about the wild ancestor of corn. Why was it so controversial? Because the wild ancestor was hard to find. It was difficult to locate a wild plant in nature that resembled corn. After much debate and the use of modern technology, scientists finally discovered that corn's wild ancestor was a small, hard-shelled plant with a single row of seeds, far from the corn we know today. In other words, corn had undergone a massive transformation. It took thousands of years for people to domesticate corn into the golden, large-eared, and full-seeded crop we recognize today. And even then, corn only contains half the protein of rice or wheat. So the indigenous peoples of the Americas faced not only harsh conditions with fewer domestication options, but the few options they had, like corn, were tough to domesticate. The author's analysis shows that, based on these three factors, climate, environment, and the availability of domesticable plant species, only 2 regions in the world had the perfect combination of conditions: ancient China and the Fertile Crescent. Thus, the earliest agricultural civilizations arose in these 2 regions. But it doesn't stop there. The author goes on to analyze the domestication of animals, because as we know, it's the combination of plant-animal domestication that completes the foundation of agricultural civilizations. So how did animal domestication play out globally? The author presents a table showing that over the course of 11,000 to 13,000 years, humans have only managed to domesticate 14 large wild mammal species. First, he defines large as animals weighing more than 100 pounds, about 45 kilograms. Why focus on large animals? While smaller animals like chickens and dogs contributed to human societies, none of them could pull plows or carts, which is why the author focuses solely on large mammals. The domestication of animals coincided with or followed closely after the rise of agriculture. Out of the 14 large mammals domesticated, 5 are considered primary contributors, while the remaining 9 are secondary. Why are these 5 the primary ones? Because they have contributed the most to human societies globally. These 5 are goats, sheep, horses, cows, and pigs. The secondary animals include camels, donkeys, reindeer, llamas, and yaks, which are important but only in specific geographic regions. For example, yaks are mostly found on the Tibetan Plateau, camels in deserts, and llamas in the Andes. The author refers to them as secondary because their contributions to humans were limited to particular regions. Of the 14 animals, 13 had wild ancestors on the Eurasian continent, with only 1, the llama, found outside Eurasia in the Andes. Let's look at the distribution of these animals in Eurasia. Ancient Chinese domesticated pigs, ancient Indians domesticated cows, and the people of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, domesticated goats and sheep. Horses were domesticated by the ancient Ukrainians over 4,000 years ago. So why were 13 of these animals native to Eurasia? Was it because people in other continents didn't want to domesticate animals? Or because they couldn't, didn't know how, or were too afraid? The author says no to all of these. The reason lies in Eurasia's vast size and diverse terrain, which provided the richest biodiversity on the planet. Africa, despite being home to iconic wildlife like the wildebeest, giraffe, and elephant, doesn't boast the same variety of species. Africa's current massive animal populations only exist because it retains the most pristine, untouched ecosystems, allowing us to see large animal herds, but not the greatest variety. The diversity of animal species in Africa and the Americas was far less than in Eurasia. However, the Americas weren't always this way. Before the end of the last ice age, the Americas were home to large mammals like giant kangaroos, American horses, and American bison. So why didn't the indigenous people of the Americas domesticate these animals? As mentioned in the Battle of Cajamarca, the indigenous people of the Americas never domesticated an animal suitable for riding. Why? Because they likely hunted many of these animals to extinction before they could domesticate them. While we have no definitive proof, it's plausible to think that these animals were so easy to hunt that they were quickly wiped out. By the time the indigenous peoples had developed the skills to domesticate animals, There were few, if any, suitable species left, certainly no horses. The same is true in Africa. So why were some animals domesticated and others weren't? Why were certain species domesticated in some regions but not others, even if they were closely related? The author introduces a principle he calls the Anna Karenina principle, inspired by the famous opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Applied to animals, this means that all domesticated animals share similar characteristics, while the ones that weren't domesticated each had their own specific flaw, not a fault of their own, but something that made them incompatible with human domestication. The Anna Karenina principle includes a series of important factors. 1. Growth rate. Animals that grow too slowly aren't practical to raise. For example, sea turtles and gorillas. Gorillas, though they have a lot of meat and seem strong, take 10 to 15 years to grow to maturity, which is far too long for humans looking for a sustainable food source. The time and patience required to raise them make them unsuitable for domestication. 2. Energy conversion efficiency. This refers to how efficiently an animal converts food into body mass. For instance, if you feed 1,000 kilograms of grass to a cow, it might produce 100 kilograms of beef. This 10% efficiency is relatively high, and sheep are similar, but carnivores, such as cheetahs, lions, or tigers, have very low energy conversion rates. You'd need to feed 1,000 kilograms of grass to cows, which would then turn into 100 kilograms of meat. If you fed that 100 kilograms of meat to a tiger, it might only gain 10 kilograms in body mass. This 1% efficiency is too low to be practical for domestication. That's why, as the author points out, none of the 14 large mammals domesticated by humans over the past 10,000 years are carnivores. They're all herbivores. Herbivores have a higher energy conversion rate, making them much more practical for human use. Number 3, reproductive rate. Animals with high reproductive rates are much more suitable for domestication. For example, pigs can have large litters of 9 to 12 piglets, making them highly productive. Similarly, if you have 300 sheep this year, you might have 350 next year and 400 the year after that. They reproduce quickly and consistently, making them ideal for domestication. However, animals with more difficult reproductive processes are much harder to domesticate. The author uses cheetahs as an example. For cheetahs to successfully mate, they need to engage in lengthy outdoor chases and courtship rituals. This makes breeding cheetahs in captivity nearly impossible. While humans have attempted to domesticate cheetahs, including in ancient Egypt and China, as depicted in ancient art, these efforts only led to taming, not true domestication. The difference between taming and domestication lies in whether humans can intentionally breed the animals to serve them. With cheetahs, breeding is so difficult that full domestication was never achieved. 4. Temperament. The temperament of an animal is crucial. Humans can't domesticate animals that are too aggressive or dangerous, like grizzly bears or brown bears. While these animals are large and could provide a lot of meat, their aggressive nature makes them impossible to manage. That said, some indigenous groups, such as the Ainu people of northern Japan, did tame brown bears for ceremonial purposes, but this was taming, not domestication, as it didn't involve breeding them on a large scale. Another notable example is zebras. People might wonder why zebras, with their striking appearance, were never domesticated as riding animals. Why didn't African warriors ride zebras in battle? The answer is that zebras, once they reach adulthood, become incredibly aggressive and often bite people, sometimes refusing to let go. In fact, more zoo staff in the U.S. are injured by zebras than by carnivorous animals. Zebras are so temperamental that despite multiple attempts, humans gave up trying to domesticate them. As a result, African societies didn't ride zebras into battle. They rode horses, which were brought over by colonizers from the Old World. Response to fear. How animals respond to fear is another crucial factor. If an animal is too nervous and prone to panic, it's unsuitable for domestication. Animals like gazelles, antelopes, and springboks are considered nervous herbivores. In the wild, if a lion appears, these animals will flee in a panicked, chaotic manner. In captivity, this tendency to panic would be disastrous. By contrast, sheep respond very differently. You might have seen videos where someone bangs a pot next to a sheep's ear, and the sheep immediately freezes and plays dead. This makes sheep ideal for domestication because they don't overreact in frightening situations. An animal's life is essentially its owner's property, so a calm response to fear is essential for successful domestication. 6. Social structure. A strong social structure is key to whether an animal can be domesticated. Animals like horses, cows, sheep, and camels all live in herds with clear leaders. If you can control the lead sheep or the lead horse, the rest of the herd will follow. This makes managing large groups much easier for humans. On the other hand, animals like rhinos are solitary. Each rhino controls a territory of 20 to 50 square kilometers, and when another rhino enters its territory, a fight is almost guaranteed. Since rhinos are solitary by nature, they're not suitable for domestication. These factors, summarized in the Anna Karenina principle, explain why some animals are domesticated while others, despite numerous attempts, remain wild. Through this series of analyses, energy conversion rates, growth rates, reproduction, temperament, fear responses, and social behavior, we see that the vast majority of animals are not suitable for domestication or partnership with humans. Only 14 large wild mammal species have been successfully domesticated by humans. This is not a coincidence. It's because these animals are exceptionally well suited for domestication, at least from a human perspective. To this day, the large mammals we rely on remain mostly those same species. The author's analysis also shows just how fortunate the early inhabitants of Eurasia were. First, in terms of plant domestication, thanks to their unique climate, diverse geographical environments, and abundant sources of domesticable plants, the earliest centers of agricultural development appeared in the Fertile Crescent and ancient China. In the second phase of animal domestication, the early Eurasians also had a significant advantage. With such a rich variety of animal species, 13 of the 14 domesticated large mammals were found on the Eurasian continent. So the inhabitants of Eurasia won twice in this game of history. This doesn't mean their ancestors were inherently superior or more hardworking, but rather that the environment of Eurasia was incredibly fertile, resource-rich, and conducive to development. After these two rounds of analysis, it becomes clear just how fortunate the early inhabitants of Eurasia were to have been able to domesticate the world's first plants and animals. The author then introduces another theory called the axis theory of diffusion. This explains why domesticated plants emerged independently in two separate regions thousands of kilometers apart, but quickly spread across the entire Eurasian continent. The author argues that diffusion along the same latitude, east to west, is much easier than diffusion along different latitudes, north to south. Eurasia's axis runs horizontally, east-west, while the axes of Africa and the Americas run vertically, north-south. Why does this matter? The difference is significant because the Earth's climate zones, tropical, temperate, and polar, vary greatly between different latitudes. For instance, Hainan Island and Heilongjiang in China are on vastly different latitudes, so their climates are completely different. The author uses a series of examples to show that diffusion along the same latitude is much faster. For example, around 3000 BCE, people in Southwest Asia invented the wheel, and within a few hundred years, the wheel had spread across all of Eurasia. Similarly, agricultural practices and animal domestication quickly spread across this vast, interconnected region. The long, horizontally oriented continent of Eurasia made it easy for innovations to travel across regions unlike the Americas and Africa. Through this series of analyses, it becomes clear why the people of Eurasia had such an enormous advantage in the development of agricultural civilization. So, what's the prize for winning the race of agricultural development? It's not a certificate or a trophy. The real prize is rapid population growth. Why does population increase so rapidly? First, agricultural societies had a stable food supply. Settled living also played a crucial role in boosting population growth. In a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, people couldn't have children too frequently. A mother couldn't raise a second child until the first one was old enough to keep up with the tribe's migrations. Thus, in hunter-gatherer societies, women typically had children about every 4 years. But once people settled down, this changed. They no longer had to wait for one child to walk before having another, and there was always enough food. With the birth of agriculture, people could grow more food, leading to several advantages in the development of society. These included population growth, increased social complexity, and division of labor. First, let's talk about population growth. More people meant more labor to plant crops, which led to the production of even more food. Next is division of labor. When agriculture reached a certain level of development, not everyone needed to be involved in food production to sustain the entire community. In the hunter-gatherer era, everyone had to work, whether hunting or foraging, to ensure survival. If you didn't contribute, you might not eat because the food gathered or hunted was barely enough. But with agricultural development, a small portion of the population could grow enough food for everyone, allowing others to specialize in different tasks. Some could become craftsmen, while others could handle tasks like managing food supplies or organizing religious rituals. As a result, agricultural societies became more complex and social structures emerged as populations grew. When populations were small, just a few dozen or a few hundred, everyone knew each other, and there was usually one person selected to be the leader of the tribe. This leader would handle decisions and resolve disputes, often chosen because everyone trusted them or because they were the strongest. In any case, there would always be someone fulfilling that role. But when populations grew to thousands or tens of thousands, it became impossible for one person to know everyone or maintain the same level of control. This is when organized structures of governance became necessary. As societies grew larger, they developed more complex social structures, eventually evolving into what we now recognize as states or nations. Another significant and transformative invention is writing. As settled civilizations continued to grow, along with the development of social divisions of labor and advancements in management tools, writing became an essential and urgent societal need. The author explains that writing wasn't invented for creative expression. The earliest purpose of writing was for record-keeping. It wasn't initially used to write poetry or prose, nor to praise or tell stories. Instead, it was used to keep records, tracking how much grain was harvested, how many sheep the tribe owned, how much milk and cheese each family contributed, and how much grain each household paid to be stored and redistributed later. The great significance of writing wasn't just the ability to record. It revolutionized the spread and accumulation of knowledge. Written records allowed knowledge to be passed on faster, more accurately, and over greater distances. This was an extraordinary breakthrough, as it facilitated the accumulation of human knowledge. Why did the invention of writing enable knowledge to be shared more quickly, last longer, travel farther, and be more precise? Imagine a scene we often see in films. Under the glowing sunset and around a roaring bonfire, a tribe gathers after a long day's work. They listen to the elders recount stories of their ancestors. This was how wisdom was passed down before the invention of writing, a process that was inefficient and unreliable. But once writing emerged, humans could record knowledge, wisdom, and experiences in a way that could be transmitted across generations, even to people who had never met. A clear example of this is how Pizarro managed to lead his men to the Americas. He had a written command from the King of Spain, and that command was recorded in writing. How did Pizarro know where to go? He read Columbus's navigational journals, which were also recorded in writing. Furthermore, Columbus's voyage, along with those of Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeu Diaz, was inspired by a book written in the 13th century. Who wrote it? Marco Polo. During the 13th century, the travels of Marco Polo was widely popular in Europe, and its descriptions of the mysterious and prosperous East, depicted as a land of gold and riches, ignited European curiosity about the Orient. This fascination led European explorers to embark on voyages, and without those writings, there wouldn't have been expeditions by Dias, Columbus, and others. This example demonstrates the importance of writing. It allowed for the development of social divisions of labor, where some people could manage while others became craftsmen. As craftsmen made continuous progress, combined with the accumulation of knowledge, they eventually developed what we now call science and technology. These advances are what gave rise to the two great advantages we saw in the Battle of Cajamarca: guns and steel. Where did these come from? Why did the Europeans have them? It was because Europeans had writing, and writing allowed for the accumulation of knowledge over generations, which led to advances in metallurgy and the ability to forge steel and create guns. However, guns and steel alone weren't enough. If you recall the title of the book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, you'll notice the inclusion of germs. What role did germs play? Why are germs listed alongside such powerful forces as guns and steel? The author provides a compelling answer. The reason germs are placed on equal footing with guns and steel is that, in the process of European conquest of the Americas, germs played a role just as significant, if not greater, than guns and steel. How could this be? The author presents several statistics. In 1492, when Columbus arrived in the New World, Mexico had an estimated population of 20 million. Yet less than 100 years later, the population had plummeted to 1.6 million. Why? Only a small percentage of these deaths were caused by direct conflict with colonizers. Around 95% of the indigenous population died from diseases brought by the Europeans, such as typhus and measles. Why did these diseases cause such devastation in the Americas, while the Europeans remained relatively unscathed? Why didn't the Europeans succumb to diseases from the indigenous peoples? The author explains that major infectious diseases, measles, smallpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, and even rabies and the plague, share a common characteristic: they all originated from animals. These diseases spread to humans and became large-scale epidemics, killing vast numbers of people. The transmission of these diseases depended on the close relationship between humans and animals. The early inhabitants of Eurasia, because of their advantageous climate, environment, and access to diverse species, were the first to domesticate both plants and animals. As they domesticated animals, such as cows, sheep, horses, and pigs, they began large-scale animal farming. However, this proximity to animals also had its downside. Humans in Eurasia were continuously exposed to a variety of animal-borne diseases. Waves of pandemics killed large numbers of people across Eurasia. But over time, those who survived developed immunity and antibodies. This is why, when European colonizers encountered the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the diseases they carried wreaked such havoc. The indigenous peoples had never been exposed to these pathogens and had no immunity, leading to catastrophic losses. Meanwhile, the Europeans had built up immunity over generations and were largely unaffected by the epidemics sweeping through the Americas. In this way, germs played an enormous role in European conquest, arguably just as critical as guns and steel. In contrast, the situation in the Americas was quite different. As we recall, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had far fewer animals suitable for domestication, which meant they lacked the close contact with animals that allowed for the transmission of diseases from animals to humans. As a result, the indigenous populations did not develop the kinds of viruses or diseases that they could pass on to the Europeans. Meanwhile, the Europeans had accumulated a vast array of viruses over thousands of years, which they brought with them to the Americas, leading to the massive death toll among the native population. When Columbus arrived in the New World, the viruses he carried arrived with him. In fact, even before Columbus's expeditions had fully spread across the Americas, the diseases he brought had already preceded him, sweeping through the continent. This is why many later European colonizers encountered vast, empty cities and abandoned villages as they explored the Americas. It was the widespread pandemics that decimated the indigenous populations of the Americas, making it possible for European colonizers to take over these lands under favorable conditions. Before the arrival of these diseases, the native populations, despite lacking steel and firearms, were large enough to mount significant resistance against European invaders. In fact, they had already started organizing defenses and could have fought back against the colonizers. However, while they could face physical weapons like guns and knives, they were powerless against the invisible, rapidly spreading diseases. As we know, viruses spread exponentially, which is why the author places germs on equal footing with guns and steel. This is central to the subtitle of the book, The Fates of Human Societies. Through this analysis, we see that the early inhabitants of Eurasia, thanks to their advantageous environment, were the first to enter agricultural civilization, allowing them to accumulate knowledge and develop firearms and steel. At the same time, their long history of living in close proximity to domesticated animals exposed them to numerous diseases. This constant exposure led to the development of antibodies and immunity, giving them the third critical factor, germs. A combination of guns, germs, and steel enabled them to conquer the New World. After this, the author delves into the uneven distribution of resources and development within Eurasia itself. Earlier, we discussed that the first two centers of agricultural civilization were the Fertile Crescent and ancient China. But why then did Europe, not these regions, conquer the New World? Let's first look at the Fertile Crescent. From around 11,000 to 13,000 BCE, people in this region began domesticating plants and animals, developing agriculture. However, over time, large-scale irrigation agriculture led to severe soil degradation and salinization, one of the major drawbacks of irrigation farming. Overuse of land through deforestation and burning also caused significant environmental damage, destroying ecosystems and making the region less suitable for agriculture. In addition, periodic climate changes in the Mediterranean reduced rainfall, further diminishing the region's agricultural potential. Another key factor was the westward shift of civilization. Under the influence of the Roman Empire and Alexander the Great, the center of power gradually moved west, eventually reaching Italy and later Europe. As for China, the author highlights how remarkably, up until the 14th century, China led the world in scientific and technological advancements. Then, abruptly, progress seemed to stop. The author gives an example. In the 14th century, during the Yuan dynasty, the Chinese invented an advanced water-powered spinning machine. This invention came 400 years before the same technology would be developed in Europe, where it would mark the start of the Industrial Revolution. So, why did the Industrial Revolution occur in Europe rather than in China? The author explains that China's centralized imperial power played a critical role. The Chinese emperor had absolute authority, and a single decree from the emperor could quickly halt entire areas of development. The example of Zheng He's voyages is particularly striking. Zheng He sailed the seas decades before Columbus and Vasco da Gama. By the time Columbus was born, Zheng He had already been dead for many years. Zheng He's fleet was far superior to Columbus's in terms of ship size, capabilities, and crew. However, after Zheng He's voyages ended, the Chinese emperor issued a ban on maritime exploration, forbidding any more long-distance voyages. Once the ban was in place, shipyards went out of business, shipbuilders lost their jobs, and naval architects stopped developing new designs. Maritime innovation came to a halt. Similarly, during this period, Chinese emperors began to regard many advanced handicrafts as frivolous or indulgent, turning their focus to what we would call the arts, like calligraphy, painting, and music. The author also offers an example from Japan. In the 16th century, Japan possessed the world's most advanced firearm technology. When two Portuguese traders introduced firearms to Japan, the Japanese were immediately impressed by their range and power, leading to rapid innovation and improvement. By the mid-16th century, Japan had developed the world's most sophisticated firearms. However, as gun technology advanced, it faced increasing resistance from the samurai class, who viewed firearms as dishonorable weapons lacking the spirit of traditional combat. Under pressure from the samurai, firearm production and development were heavily restricted, and eventually, firearm technology in Japan virtually disappeared. In conclusion, while both China and Japan were technologically advanced, political and cultural decisions halted their progress. Europe, on the other hand, continued to innovate and expand its technological capabilities, which, combined with the spread of germs and the development of guns and steel, allowed it to dominate much of the world. Let's recap the core content of this book. Through a series of analyses, the author shows us that the early inhabitants of Eurasia were not the first to develop agricultural civilizations because they were smarter, but because they had the advantage of the most favorable climate conditions, geographical environment, and a rich diversity of species. Next, the settled agricultural societies that first arose in Eurasia benefited from what the author calls the axis theory. Eurasia's east-west axis made it easier for agricultural innovations to spread rapidly across the continent due to similar latitudes. As a result, Eurasia was the first to fully enter into agricultural civilization. This led to the development of complex societies, the creation of states, the invention of writing, the accumulation of knowledge, and technological advancements. Eventually, the people of Eurasia had access to more sophisticated products, including guns and steel. Through the domestication of animals, they also became carriers of viruses and antibodies, which ultimately enabled them to conquer the Americas. This, in essence, is the core message of the book. Of course, there are many more fascinating examples, stories, historical anecdotes, and insightful analyses throughout the book. I encourage you to pick up a copy and read it in detail. That's all for today's presentation. Thank you.